Hi everyone, welcome to yet another video from Trevor Gallagher Drums. I'm Trevor. Today I thought we would look at actual snare wires and how to change up a set of snare wires, how to tension them correctly, and so on and so on. Now, how often should you replace your snare wires? Well, that really depends on how much you play. It also depends on how fussy, I suppose, you want to be with your sound. You know, I know some people that, buy a snare drum and they'll leave the snare wire on there forever, basically. But they do fatigue through time from hitting them, especially if you're a hard hitter. Snare wires do fatigue and they do change in sound through time. Well, that's been my experience of them anyway. So I change my snare wires up about once every couple of years. Some people change them in shorter periods of time, some longer, like I said, and some people never change them. So let's look at snare wires, how to replace a set of snare wires, what sort of tension, what type of snare wire you should use. On this particular drum here, this is a 5-inch Ludwig Super, not to be confused with Superphonic. It's a chrome over brass snare drum. And on this particular snare drum, I have a 20-strand Canopus vintage snare wire on it. I love Canopus snare wires. I think they're the best sounding snare wires on the planet. I used to use Pure Sound for many years. I found them to be really good. But then one day I tried some of these Canopus snare wires. Well, actually, I bought a Canopus snare drum and I thought, wow, this drum sounds amazing. And I was talking to our local distributor and about the drum and the snare wires, and he said, yeah, the snare wires are really, really good. Try them on another drum. So I did, and I just love them. And because they sound so good, every snare drum I own, including my vintage snare drums, all have Canopus sound wires. Snare wires. This one, as I said, is what they call a vintage snare wire. They make other models, and if you go to the Canopus website, you can have a look at their snare wires and what they all sound like and how many strands. You might want a 42 or 43 strand. You might want less than 20. I love 20 strand snare wires. They just a really good overall general good sounding snare wire in my opinion. But, each to their own. Depending on the music you play too, you might like a thinner one. You might like a thicker snare wire, more multiple strands. So it's up to you, really. So anyway, let's look at this. So if I was going to replace this snare wire, first thing I would do would be undo the little lugs on both sides and release the snare wire and pull it off. It's that simple. Now, different snare brands have different sort of mechanisms to hold on their snare wires, but they basically is a little bar that tightens up onto either the plastic, or some people use strings, some people use like a nylon webbing type tape. There's many varieties, but they all basically do the same thing. So you loosen up these, take this one off, you put the new snare down and put them through and tighten it up. Now, when you do that, well, before you put a new snare wire on, what I would normally do is I would wind off my strainer, wind it back a fair bit, so I've got a lot of room to tighten if I need to tighten a bit later down the track. So what I do, as I said, I loosen it all off and then I turn the snare on. Once I've done that, I put the new snare wire down and I do my best to have it even on both sides. This one's a little bit off. It's a little bit more that way than this way, but it's okay. As long as it's roughly about the same, that's probably the way to approach it. So I put it equal. I tighten down the nuts to hold it in place. And that's basically all you're really doing to it. Then once I've done that, I will turn it over and I will hit the snare. Now, as you can see here, it's really loose. It's just rattling away because the tension on it is way too loose. So what is the perfect tension for your snare wire? Well, for me, I go from that very loose and I just wind it up a little turn at a time until I get it a little bit tighter, so it changes to, it's still got a little bit of looseness to it, but it's actually you know, sitting flush and even on the actual snare bed side. So that's way too loose. So if I take it up a couple of notches, it's still way too loose. Now I'm starting to get to here. That snare is actually not so loose now. I'll probably go up one more little notch. And even that for me is probably a bit tight. The more you tension it, starts to get tighter and drier sounding, and I like my snares to be a little bit more loose and floppy, for want of a better word. So I'll just take that back one notch. And to me, that's where I like it. You know, do I want to go back? That'll be okay there too, going one tighter. But I wouldn't want to make it any tighter than that. So that's basically how I set up a snare wire. So I'll just run through quickly how to do all that again, just to recap, so you got it all there. So if you're replacing the snare wire, undo the nuts on both sides, pull out the old one, stick the other one back in exactly the same way as you took the other one off. Before I tighten them up, I'll loosen off the tension strainer and then put it on, you know, so it's firm in that position, and then I'll start winding up the tension strainer one little notch at a time until I start to get that sound where it's just losing that really absolute loose rattle, and to bring it up to just where it's actually got that tension. There's a sweet spot, and you know, play around with it. You can tighten it up and loosen it off, and you'll find there's an area within a couple of turns will be exactly where you want that snare wire to be. So on that note, people, I think if that should make sense to you, and try, you know, higher tension, lower tension on your snare, and just see if you can find the sound you really like with that snare. The tension of the snare wires makes a big difference to the sound of your drum. So just go up and down till you find that spot where you really like the sound of it. And there is a definite sweet spot in those snare tensions. So on that note, we'll leave this little video at that. And if you have any questions about snare tension or anything at all, just to leave a message below in video on YouTube. And if you have any topics you would like me to discuss in future videos, by all means, drop another message down below and contact me. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you would hit the subscribe button. Really do me a great favor if you do that. I'm trying to build the channel. So it takes 2 seconds to go click, and it doesn't really, you know, it's no big effort to do that for you, but it greatly helps me if you decide to do that. So please subscribe. Please tell all your drummer friends about my channel and encourage them to subscribe as well. And that would be really fine. And on that note, people, happy drumming. Get out there, tune up your snare drum. Get that really good snare tension on your drum. Go out there and play some killer drumming and expose yourself to the world and let them see how brilliant you are as a drummer. Bye.